Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into bullying, which is an incredibly important topic. And it stems from something that happened in February, and that was the death of Drake Hardman. And he died by suicide. And as I was preparing for the show today, I was reading about this case, and it made me realize how even more important this topic is, because the reason why Drake committed suicide was because of bullying. And you talked about this story with Frankie and Jess on the air, and what more could have been done, and really nothing more could have been done. And it sounds like the mom was on board with what the school was doing, and because they suspended the bully, they did everything they could to take action to try to prevent it from happening. But ultimately, I think the only other thing they could have done was expel the kid, and maybe going forward, that might be the new precedent, is a zero tolerance for bullying. And actually, my kids were in a school in Utah where a mom told me that kids were expelled. It was a charter school, and kids were expelled for bullying.
Well, I think in that type of setting, so charter schools and independent schools, they do it because they can.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And the rules are a little bit different. But I remember I listened to the interview because the parents, I think, did some interviews on TV. So I listened to that and read the articles. And I agree. I could not see one thing that those parents could have done differently. And the thing that was really tough is they were talking to their son about this.
Yes.
And he was, for good reasons, he thought he was going to get hurt, or I think they threatened him and maybe a sibling if he told. And so, the threats that he was receiving are the things that made him deny it. And although it was still going on, it was a big deal for him, but he didn't want to, expose anyone else to any type of danger. And when you're that age, was he 12? I think he was 12.
Yes.
Everything, it seems real that this kid who's so powerful can do anything to you. So it's such a tragedy. And maybe we could start by just defining what is bullying. I think that, there's no, singular or definitive definition of what bullying is. In its simplest form, I suppose if you feel like you're being bullied, you're probably being bullied.
Yeah.
But, bullying comes in all different types and shapes and sizes and subtleties. But I think it's, in its simplest form, it's unwanted behavior from one person to another designed to hurt or harm or cause distress to them. So things like intimidation, insults, humiliation, it can be related to, say, your age, your disability. I don't know what it was in the case of this story that you're referring to, what he was being bullied about. Do you recall?
They didn't specify in the article that I read, just that there was consistent and reoccurring bullying going on. And another comment that I'd like to make as far as what would consist of bullying, I would almost say it has to be repeated at least more than once.
Right.
Because kids are kids, and they're learning boundaries. And I think it's very important to speak up when a child comes to you and says, someone said this, or they did this and this hurt me, or I didn't like this. It's very important to address that, but don't automatically label it as bullying. I had a really good instance with this with my older daughter, where she came home and she was telling me about this boy in class who was talking about his scores and how his scores were really good, or they were comparing scores, something with a test with one another. And then there had been this other incident where they were roughhousing and she had gotten hurt. And I was a little bit concerned, but I didn't want to just say, oh no, my child's being bullied. But I wanted to make the teacher aware of my concerns. She responded very appropriately. She validated my concerns. She looked into it. She paid attention. But she also assured me, she said, I know this kid and I don't think it's a problem, but I will keep an eye out. And I was very impressed with the way the teacher handled that.
I think you're right that repeated behavior, that's exactly right. What bullies do is they zero in on something that is different about the person.
Mm-hmm.
Race, religion, gender, sex, sexual orientation, any personal characteristic, could be a hobby. It could be anything like that because they want to get at the person and they need some way in, which then they can focus on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good way to think of bullying. I think that as parents, with children who are in the schools, to pay attention to their world and
Mm-hmm.
who their friends are and what's going on in school. I think the other thing to be aware of is notice differences in their behavior, small
Yes.
differences in their behavior. And either they may come home and maybe they aren't as happy or, carefree as they might have been. There may be some resistance to going to school. So
Yes.
if that didn't exist before and then, kind of out of the blue, your child says, I don't want to go to school. I think that's a red flag. Now, it doesn't mean he's being bullied. I don't want to say that, but
Right.
I think we look for the red flags, and that's one of those red flags. I think if their grades tend to drop when, maybe they've been a great student and then all of a sudden they're having trouble focusing and they aren't doing as well in school, that's another red flag. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean bullying, but it means that something's going on. Something is different in that
Yes.
child's life. And so that's where you really need to pay attention and follow through on it.
And I have a story, a really good story of a good friend of mine who lives in Utah, and her son was in first grade and he loved going to school. Absolutely loved it. The kid is a complete extrovert, thrives on social interaction, loves to be around other kids, and loved going to school. And all of a sudden, he didn't want to anymore. He hated going to school. There was this major shift in behavior. And very, very slowly but surely, she was able to tease it out of him that there was bullying going on. And she talked to the teacher and she was working with the teacher and they were trying to resolve it, but nothing was really happening. It wasn't really changing until it finally came to the point that it got physical. And
Mm-hmm.
her son had been, I don't know that there was necessarily like a bruise or any sort of mark, but her son came home and said that he had been punched in the face. And at that point, her son did not go to school the next day, which I feel is very appropriate. And, as I was discussing this with her to talk about this on the podcast, she said she wasn't sure if she would classify it as severe bullying. I would.
Mm-hmm.
If it gets physical, I would classify that
Yeah.
as severe
Yeah.
because and the fact that it had been repeatedly going on. And she told the school, she said, until this is resolved, until this is figured out, my son is not going back to school because it is not safe for him. And she handled it very well with her son. She made sure that he knew and understood he's not in trouble. You are not staying home because you are in trouble. You are staying home to keep you safe. And her mom also happens to be a family lawyer. And her mom went to the school with her to discuss it. And, they had to let the school know and all of that kind of stuff. But I think she handled it very appropriately. And again, the tricky part is that it's a public school. And so
Yeah.
they
They're
can't,
limited,
and they can't just kick this boy out of school
right?
that's doing the bullying. They can't just expel him because it's a public school and it's first grade. I think it would be different if this were maybe junior high or high school. But, again, they're limited. And so the important things in this story are that, one, she was paying attention and she recognized, like you said, that change in the child's behavior, in her son's behavior. He all of a sudden didn't want to go to school when he loves school. And two, that she took immediate, precise, and direct action and she didn't let it go. So one of the things that she brought up with me, because I told her, it's like, I want to mention your mom being involved because I think it's important for parents to know. And she said that having an educational lawyer, which is part of what her mom does as family law, it's not only needed in extreme bullying. You can do that in any instance of bullying. You can have a family lawyer present. And the reason why her mom wanted to go is because she knows that some schools and some school districts will try to sweep these problems under the rug.
Right. I agree.
And that's a problem. and it shouldn't be. So as I was reading this article, I heard this staggering statistic that just, I mean, it made my heart drop. So currently in the state of Utah, suicide is the leading cause of death for youths ages 10 to 17. That
Mhm.
is a huge, huge problem, and it's unacceptable.
Right. Do they break down the information you have? Do they break it down on the reason?
I didn't see any reason for bullying.
Well, no, for suicide, because I don't
Oh,
know
okay.
I don't know what the stats are, but a high percentage of those kids committing suicide are going to have questions about their sexual orientation. That
Interesting.
we know that that's true. And
Okay.
so what happens is, well, there's all these cultural things that happen. They feel shame around it, and they feel like their family isn't going to accept them. They hide it.
Right.
They can't be authentic, and so suicide, I think, is really about a hopelessness that things are not going to get better or be able to
Hmm.
change, and they see it as their only way out. And
Right.
so that is a big reason. It's one of the major reasons why adolescents do kill themselves.
Yes, and it's absolutely tragic, and
Mhm.
certainly bullying of any type should not be tolerated. And so it's very, very important for parents to one, advocate, and also to keep a cool head, because
Right.
it can be so easy. And as a mom, I understand how hard it is when your child is being hurt. The mama bear comes out, and it's very easy to react, but if you do that, you're more likely to be met with pushback from the school. You're more likely to be reacted towards, and not that you should be, but the reality is the school administration and teachers are more likely to look at you as just an irrational, overreacting parent that wants to protect their child.
So maybe we should talk about why. Why do people bully? Why do kids bully? Why do people bully? And the
Absolutely.
information that I'm going to pass on comes from a rather large study that was done, over 7,000 participants, which in this type of work is a pretty, what we call N, the N of over 7,000. It's a pretty large N.
Hmm.
And so what they were doing is they were talking to people who who were bullies, and also those who weren't, and they're trying to look at the differences. And but they got deeper into, what's going on in that person's life who is doing the bullying.
Yes.
And so here are some things that may contribute to a person bullying. The first one is stress or trauma. And so, let's say a child's life or even an adult's life, is there a stress or trauma? There's various ways that one can deal with that. Now, if you have a fairly functional family, then you have that support and that stress and trauma is dealt with in a healthy way.
Hmm.
But if you come from a family where you don't have that healthy support, then you express that stress in different ways. Now, for older kids, it might be alcohol or drugs, but it's negative behaviors like violence or bullying. And what it does, it temporarily masks those issues. And I think in some ways, what it does is it temporarily makes the bully feel powerful.
Yes.
So what happens? They're in this situation, either the stress or the trauma, where they're not feeling powerful. And one of the next ones that we're going to talk about is low self-esteem. And the same thing. How do you temporarily raise your self-esteem? And we see this all the time. You put someone else down. Now, most of the time, it's just a verbal put down, which can still be pretty harmful. But you get into this habit of bullying as a way, essentially, to relieve your stress. So stress and trauma in a person's life. And then the next thing, here's the interesting statistic about gender. 66% of people who admitted to bullying were males.
Hmm.
Now, you have to look at the cultural issues behind this. Aggressive male behavior is rewarded in our culture. I mean, do you
Hmm.
think I think that's accurate.
I
What do you
think
think about that?
I think yes and no. I think it's rewarded in maybe sort of a roundabout way. I mean, the only way I can think of is that it's rewarded is that if you are seen as, I guess I think in terms of military, if you go out and you're defending someone, you're defending our freedom, you're defending our country, that can be seen as a sign of aggression. But that's also necessary. I mean, I have nothing but absolute respect for soldiers, and
And Go ahead.
And in that instance, their aggression is absolutely needed. I mean, the only other instance that I can think of, and you're gonna know exactly, is what happened at the Oscars.
Okay, I was going to bring that up
Yep.
because okay, so this guy is triggered. So Will
Yes.
Smith is triggered.
Uh-huh.
He gets up and his frontal lobes aren't functioning well, and he goes and he assaults another person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many minutes later, the audience gives him a standing ovation.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So in our culture, aggression is rewarded. Why would you do that was baffling to me. They should have kicked him out. They shouldn't have let him
Immediately.
go. Shouldn't have let him go sit back down. They said, okay, you need to leave now. That
Yes.
is the appropriate response. But instead, he sits there and then later he gets up tearful and says, I'm so sorry, whatever I did this, makes an apology. So I think that males tend to be more aggressive than
Yeah.
females. Now, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people would say, oh, it's because they have more testosterone. A lot of people misunderstand the role of testosterone, and testosterone does not cause aggression.
Okay.
Testosterone amplifies whatever traits are already there.
Oh, okay.
So if the male is somewhat aggressive and that's being rewarded
Mm-hmm.
by culture, the testosterone just tends to amplify it.
Mm-hmm.
So we misunderstand testosterone. But I think, it's important to realize that being aggressive, or so if you're an adolescent male and you want to look good in the eyes of your peers and you're a bully, you're going to get some of that admiration, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can see that it's going to be reinforced. Oh, here's the cool guy beating up on, the little guy.
Yeah, Will Smith has been all over the news in what happened, and I listened to a couple of surveys of people who think that he reacted appropriately, and there are a lot of people who did, who think that because Chris Rock made an ill-favored joke, that it
Right.
was
No,
okay.
I don't know that anybody's defending the joke. I mean,
No, but they
that's not the point.
but they think but there's a lot of people out there that think because Chris Rock made this joke that Will Smith's actions were acceptable. And
Okay, so that's my
that's
point, Liz.
wrong.
But
Yeah.
see, that's my point is that
Yeah.
aggression or assault is okay in response to a poor joke. And so
Right.
there's a certain number of people in our culture who think that's okay. I think there are many, many more who think it's not okay.
I'd
I
hope
think
so.
I think the negative comments about his behavior have outweighed, saying, yeah, he should have done that. There's so many other responses that, could have happened that it would be more appropriate.
Exactly. I think, and I've thought about this a lot, is the best thing Will Smith could have done in that instance is got up and walked out. And he could have even gone up there and said, "You crossed a line. That is my wife," and left.
Well, I think both of them, they're sitting
Yes.
together, they get up and they walk out. That is a huge statement.
Yeah.
I agree. Like we're not gonna stay here and be insulted by you. And that would have been on TV,
Hmm.
nonviolent. That would have been so much louder, I think, with no
Right.
negative pushback. I knew we were gonna talk about Will Smith because it's just
Right.
all over the culture.
Ex- Oh, exactly. I thought the same thing. And, I think the other problem too is what it comes down to is money. The rich and the
Mhm.
powerful. I
Yeah,
mean,
sure. Yes.
Will Smith, he's incredibly influential.
Yep.
And, and so I mean, who's going to want to kick Will Smith out of the
Right.
Grammys?
Right.
But it's not fair and it's not right,
Yeah.
you
No, I
know.
agree. I agree with you. Okay, some other reasons. Low self-esteem, which
Mhm.
I mentioned. It's just a way to help you feel temporarily more powerful. A lot of these bullies have also been bullied themselves,
Yep.
which is certainly understandable. So they're reacting to, I think, what's been done to them. And again, I think in the end, it's trying to be powerful. It's trying to have a sense of power when you don't feel any. And so
Mhm.
being bullied really takes away your power. Difficult
Yeah.
home life. A third of the people who bullied told us that they didn't feel like they spend enough time with their parents or their guardians. They're more likely to come from larger families
Mhm.
and more likely to live with people other than their biological parents.
Okay.
And so there are often feelings of rejection, in the family that they feel, that the very people who should love them don't, or
Mm-hmm.
that they only love them conditionally. And so they're also more likely to come from violent households. So it's what they've seen,
Yep.
and they're experiencing it. And the other interesting thing I thought was low access to education. So,
Okay.
those people who don't have access to consistent and positive education are more likely to end up being bullies. I think part of that happens. You don't learn to have empathy for other people. I
Mm-hmm.
think part of what happens in school, even in the public system, is if it's done even reasonably well, you're learning some empathy along the
Yeah.
way because you're in a class of 30 kids. And, I think most teachers are aware of that they have an influence in that regard to a child's life, is that you can teach them empathy.
Mm-hmm.
The final one, relationships. The people who bully tend to feel like the important relationships, families, friends, are not very secure. And so they're feeling insecure in their life. And so sometimes it could be even in order to keep their friendships, they might be pressured by peers to behave in such a way. It comes back to that aggression that, again, especially for males. So given that most of the bullies, not all, but most of the bullies tend to be male, and a lot of them probably tend to be aggressive, that it probably ends up being physical
Mm-hmm.
because that's rewarded in a lot of ways.
Right. And as you're talking about how it makes them feel powerful, one thing that we know that everyone needs on an emotional level is control.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, yeah.
and adolescents, they don't have a lot of control over what goes on in their lives. And so often when you act out and when you bully, it gives them a sense of control.
That's,
And
I think you're right.
power control, I mean, they're intermingled. And so oftentimes I think that's why most kids act out, is it's a power struggle. That's really
Mm-hmm.
what it comes down to. And it's very natural for kids to seek control because they need it. And, and it's okay for them to have control over certain things. Giving kids choices is a good thing. And I think we should do that every opportunity we get. And when that is really, really suppressed in kids, or when they have no control over their home situation, what's going on at home, they're going to act out and they're going to go find other ways to get control. And if they can control the emotions and the feelings of someone else through manipulating them and bringing them down, it's going to give them that sense of control. And I think once they get a taste of it, it can be really hard to let go of that because they know it's almost like an addict returning to the drug. They know where they can get that hit. I can
Yeah.
get that hit of that control and that power by belittling this person.
So I think we focused, and maybe we'll go back a little bit about what you can do for the child who has been bullied.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more needs to be done for the bully themselves too.
Yes.
So yes, you can expel them from school, and that's a consequence. And that's a consequence that tends to help protect all the other children.
Right.
But in the end, I don't know that it solves whatever issues going on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I realize there's certainly a lack of funds, especially in the public schools, but figuring out a way to get some sort of mental health treatment or just some sort of assessment, and
Mm-hmm.
if we could just say that, an assessment about what is going on in this child's life. So I think we need to be more curious
Yeah.
about what's behind the bullying. And so, yeah, we can say we're going to come down hard on this kid, with some sort of consequence, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more important that we look at what's the cause of it. So, what's going on in their family? What kind of stress are they under? Have they been bullied themselves? What kind of trauma might they have experienced? So, I think that's one of the biggest changes that could be made within the system, is to try to understand on an individual basis what's going on with the kid.
Absolutely. So, in this article that I was reading, and I'll post this article because a lot was said, and it's an article from the Salt Lake Tribune, and it ran on February 25th of this year, is when this article ran. And one of the things that Drake's mom said was that even amongst the pain that she was feeling for her child, she was concerned about this kid that bullied her, because obviously what happened to Drake is a tragedy, and that's the most important tragedy. But how do you think that kid is feeling that did the bullying right now? I mean, knowing what he caused, that is psychologically, he's going to be in a bad place for a long time, if not the rest of his life. That is something that you carry with you.
Well, it also implies he has some empathy, though, which I mean, we don't know. I mean,
That's true.
that would be part of the assessment. It's to figure out on a deeper level what's happening with the kid. And I think that's what the mother was expressing
Yeah.
probably is, what's going on with this kid? How did he get
Mm-hmm.
there? And I think as a society, we need to spend more time wondering, how do these kids get to this place
Yeah.
where that's an acceptable response? Which I
Mm-hmm.
think, just one final foray into the Oscars, we ought to be thinking as a culture, how do we get to this place that the guy running up on the stage and hitting someone on national TV is then given a standing ovation? We ought to think about that. That's
Yeah.
a problem in our national psyche. Anyway, I'll move away from Will Smith because that was just so shocking to me.
I know. It's just the response. It's the fact
Yeah,
that he got away with it.
yeah.
And in a way, I respect Chris Rock for not pressing charges. I think he was the bigger person in that instance.
Well,
But
I
at the
agree with
same,
that. Yeah.
but on the same token, no one said a thing to Will
Mm-mm,
Smith about it. No
mm-mm.
one. I mean, if I were Jada Pinkett Smith, I would feel really torn, because on the one hand, here's my husband defending my honor, but on the other hand, you're acting in violence over this. That's a
Yeah.
big red flag, you
Yeah.
know?
And so I really like your idea. I hadn't thought of that. Just get up and walk out.
Yeah.
Anyway, what do you do with the child?
Yes.
Let's just outline some steps as a way to wrap this part up. Is what do you do with the child? And I think first and foremost, you care for them because they've gone through, they're having a traumatic event themselves. And so, taking care of your child is the most important thing. But
Mm-hmm.
after that, I think you need the facts, which is what I think you mentioned early on, is you don't want to assume it's bullying even
Mm-hmm.
if the child comes home and says whatever the child says. I think you need some facts.
Yes.
And so I think it's important to document the facts as much as you can. And then something that I think is probably important, as far as you talking to the school, but I think this can be really important for the child as well. And that's writing down their story.
Mm.
Like, creating a narrative with the child is helpful because it helps them make sense of it.
Yeah.
Because most children who are going to be bullied, like a lot of things in childhood, we tend to internalize it. So, if someone's bullying this kid because he's different in some way. I can't, like, maybe he plays an instrument in the band and
Mm-hmm.
it's a different instrument and they're bullying him because of that. Well, he internalizes that, and what he thinks is, well, if I just didn't play this instrument, then they wouldn't bully me, which is not true.
Yeah.
They would just find something else. It's
Mm-hmm.
just what they're doing is they're picking out something that's unique about that person. They're using that as the way in to the bullying. And then the child who's being bullied tends to internalize it and thinks this is what kids do. This is my fault some way. If
Mm-hmm.
I were not like this, then they wouldn't bully me. And I think telling the story, writing down the story, and as parents, what we can do is help the child to have a realistic view of what's going on. This is not about them.
Yes.
This is about the bully and their behavior. See, I think that in the end, we don't know about this 12-year-old who killed himself,
Mm-hmm.
but, did he internalize it to such a state that this is about me and I deserve this bullying? Because kids often do that.
Right. And something that Lindy and I talked about last week, when if a child comes home to you and says, or asks the question, or so and so said I'm fat, and you
Mm-hmm.
made a mark about her appearance, our first instinct as a parent is say, no, 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 that's not true. But the message that sends to the child is that we can't tolerate an uncomfortable emotion. We can't tolerate that someone is saying something bad about us. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we need to do is we need to internally take a deep breath, and you need to really try to temper your reaction and say, if your child comes home and says, so and so is doing this, or they're saying this about me, or when it's verbal bullying going on, you need to ask them, okay, well, tell me what you think about what they said.
And what you're talking about really is emotion coaching, that we've talked
Yes.
about for a long time. And, this ties in a lot of our previous episodes that if parents can do that to reach their child on that emotional level
Mm-hmm.
first, because it doesn't mean you aren't going to help them solve it, but to interact with them on that emotional level from an early age, that is so helpful in your relationship for the rest of their
Mm-hmm.
lives.
Yeah. And it helps them to be able to work through it because, I mean,
Yes, yes.
have you ever seen anybody get worked up who's really like, just amped up about something and you can tell help somebody else to calm down about anything? No.
It, it
It,
doesn't. No.
it it's
It just tends to
it's
ramp everybody in the room up.
exactly. So it's so important for you to remain calm and let your child express
Yeah,
how they feel about it and then walk through the emotions and then let the child know that you are taking action. Let your
right.
child know we're going to go to the school and we're going to address this.
So you can take action and still be calm. So you
Yes.
don't have to be angry and loud and mean. I mean, you talked about this right at the start of this episode, is you don't have to go in and feel out of control
Mhm.
because you aren't going to be listened to as well as if you go in calmly. So the next step is hopefully the school has an anti-bullying policy or state laws about it. So you need to review that. Then you report the bullying to the school. And then, as we've talked about, you monitor the school's response.
Mhm.
But I think if you have to go up the district, so if the principal isn't giving you the response you need, I guess I don't know what the next level is in a school district. I mean, eventually
Superintendent.
is the superintendent the next one up then?
Yeah.
So, there are probably various levels in there. And so you take it up there. But ultimately, what you said, I want to reinforce also, is that sometimes you may need legal help.
Yes.
We had an incident that I think I can talk about vaguely. It wasn't really bullying. It was an adolescent who was being sexually harassed. And this person did not want to report it. Turns out we had to just because of state reporting laws.
Mhm.
But she didn't want to report it because of fear of the repercussions. But when it was reported, it was like a weight was lifted off. But
Mhm.
this person's parent is an attorney and knew and said, I'm going to get her an attorney right off, and got her an attorney. It made all the difference
Mhm.
because sometimes you need, and I realize it's a cost,
Yep.
but sometimes you need the school or the school district to take you seriously. And for whatever, I mean, we all know the reason. If you show up with an attorney, they're much more likely to take you seriously. And
Yes.
that's a sad comment, I think, in and of itself, that's what we have to do in order to have this taken seriously. But I think it is sometimes.
Yes. And in the instance of my friend who brought along her mother, leading up to that, she felt that the school had taken appropriate action. The school was trying, but again, they're limited with what they can do. And it was actually her mom who said, "Do you want me to go with you?" And at that point, my friend had to let the school know that she was bringing an attorney. So I want you to, like, just sometimes telling them that
Yeah.
will often get a response like, I have a lawyer. And I think in the instance of my friend, she's able to explain, my mom, she is a lawyer, but she wants to come with me on a support level. But she had to give the school the opportunity to respond in case they wanted to provide their own lawyer.
Sure.
So be aware that that could be a common response is for the school to also get a lawyer. And honestly, I think that would be a good sign because it means
Mhm.
that they're taking things seriously.
But so I want to clarify something. You made me think of this, that this does not mean that all schools aren't going to respond appropriately. I think there are
Right.
many schools out there and many school administrators who will respond appropriately. But I think for the safety of the kids, for your own child, sometimes you might
Hmm.
have to resort to those particular measures.
And don't be afraid to do it. I
Yeah.
mean, the last thing you want is this instance of what happened with Drake Hardman. And, Drake's mom even said that the school handled it the whole time. They handled it and they were aware of it and they were doing what they can. But again, they're limited in what they can do because it is a public school. And sometimes I think homeschooling could be an option as well, and or charter schools, or you have options besides just a public school, just so parents know. And one thing that I wanted to bring up that I like the idea of, that, and this was an idea of Drake's mom. She said not just the victim of bullying needs to have someone to talk to and connect to, but the individual who is engaged in the bullying as well.
Right. There's probably a whole group of kids that are standing around watching.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and sorry, I misspoke. This was Amy Steele Smith, who is a bullying prevention specialist with the State Utah Board of Education. It was her that suggested that. I wanted to clarify that. And I love the idea of, if a child is bullying, they need to go see counseling. They need intervention too, because they're not doing it because they feel good about themselves. I mean, hurt people hurt people. And so I love that idea.
Yeah, and I think it would be unusual if the bully is doing it without other kids watching. I think that's part of the allure. It's part of building the bully up, is that he has an audience, or this person has an audience. So I think that as a culture, we have to decide that it's not okay, but how are we going to help these kids who are behaving that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So next week, we are going to get into a listener story, and we're going to talk about rebuilding trust. And this comes from a listener who we can keep anonymous, and stay tuned for more details. We'll see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.